Welcome back to Pie in the Pound, everyone. Today we're doing something a little different. We're starting with the microeconomics of poverty, the daily choices that keep people trapped. But make sure you stick around until the end because I'll be grilling my guest on how he built an insane economics profile and cracked the US college admissions process as a high schooler. Joining me to look at this from a completely different geographic lens is Arnav Maheshwari, dialing in from Georgia in the US. Arnav and I are both in high school, but his background in economics is honestly insane. He's currently working with the World Bank, the USDA, and the World Food Program. He recently captained the highest ranked US team to a silver medal at the Economics World Cup, beating out thousands of competitors globally. He was also a finalist for the Oxford School for the Future's Harbinger Prize for his writing on global entrepreneurship, which fast tracked him to becoming editor in chief of a global magazine in under 18 months. I could honestly keep going, but if I list all your achievements, reading your resume is going to take up this entire episode. Arnav, it's awesome to finally have you.
Hey Kavya, thanks so much for having me. Honestly, this intro makes me seem so much cooler than I am, really. But I've really been looking forward to this one. We've been, planning this for quite a while, so I'm really glad we're able to get some time on the board and just record this. I'm really, really, really happy to be on board with Pie in the Pound.
Yeah, likewise. You earned it. So, when we talk about poverty, the media usually defaults to GDP, which is gross domestic product, national debt, or trade. Today, I want to compare the experience of poverty in a developing country like India versus a wealthy developed country like the US. So, on the surface, the environments look completely different. But I know you've
Hmm.
spent a lot of time studying this. The psychology and the invisible barriers are remarkably similar, right?
100% right. I think it's pretty evident, but I myself am from India and I live in the US as of right now as well. So I've done good amount of study into both of these countries. So how I would put it, quite frankly, is people in the US often assume that because we have paved roads and these massive supermarkets as you can find on Google or on Instagram, poverty here is somehow easier than it is in developing countries like India. But the traps are obviously not gone. I would say they're just designed differently. If you look at the book, very famous one, Poor Economics by Abhijit Banerjee, I think this is one of the things we also connected over. And his wife, Esther Duflo, they outline this fundamental concept called the S curve, which is basically a financial trapdoor.
Yeah. So, for our listeners, picture an S on a graph mapping your current wealth against your future wealth. What happens at that tipping point, Arnav?
So, well, if you really start with too little wealth, as is the case in some of these developing countries, structurally underdeveloped countries, your income actually starts to shrink over time. You're treading water, if I put it simply, and but the current is pulling you under. So you're trying to go, and the current's pulling you under. But if you get a big enough push, like a substantial grant or a major asset, you cross this invisible line, and suddenly your wealth starts to grow on its own. So this is a threshold I think you're referring to as well. And then what happens is your wealth compounds, which completely dismantles the pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth that is quite often in rags to riches stories. But if you're below that tipping point, hard work literally is not enough because you have no buffer and you don't have that head start or like that boost that is required to uh, compound your wealth.
Yeah, right. I remember the authors mentioning that the extreme poor actually have to, act like hedge fund managers just to survive.
Exactly. I actually love that comparison. We all know that a hedge fund manager diversifies risk, right? If one asset goes down, another one of their investments will go up, and so on, and vice versa. But they do not put all of their money in one stock, correct? The extreme poor have to do the same thing. They do the exact same thing. They might farm a tiny plot of land, a small roadside stall, and do hard labor in the day. but they diversify because they don't have any formal insurance, because their energy is split across three inefficient jobs, and they never have the time or the capacity to scale any of them and go past that threshold, as we see in the S curve.
Yeah, right. And in India, that lack of a safety net is stark. A single hospital bill can force a family to sell their only asset, like, a cow or a sewing machine, instantly dropping them back below the S curve. So, how does that translate to the US context?
So before we jump into the U.S. context, I think we also have to look at GDP per capita. It isn't the best measure of economic equality, obviously, but you also have to look in India that the GDP per capita is much smaller. I think it's in the 2,500 dollar range, which translates to, if I'm not wrong, 2-3 lakh rupees, right? And then on the other hand, in the U.S., it's closer to $60,000, which is far more than 2 to 3 lakh rupees, which is I'm assuming around 40-50 lakhs. So now in the US, this trap of the hospital bill, like you said in India, operates through what sociologists call the zip code density. And this is compounded by the gig economy. A lot of the public schools here, in fact, I go to a public school, as a lot of my peers do, are funded by local property taxes. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, your school is underserved and underfunded. Whereas if you live in a more expensive, more upscale neighborhood, oftentimes you'll see that your public school is a lot better funded, a lot better equipped, and has better facilities. So you don't get the skills for a high paying job if you go to one of these underserved schools. So you become what is called a gig worker. You drive an Uber in the morning, you do DoorDash at night, and work on retail in retail stores like Walmart and Target over the weekends. So where in India you're diversifying between plowing a field, running a stall on the side of the road. Here in the U.S., you're diversifying your labor through um, all three of these jobs, but you don't have healthcare. So one car breakdown or one ER visit, just like in India, can really just put you down below that S curve as well. Because in the U.S., healthcare is known for being notoriously expensive, as you may have heard.
Yeah. Honestly, that's a brutal parallel, right? And speaking of getting that push to cross the S curve for decades, global organizations pushed the idea that microfinance was the magic bullet. So, give a poor individual a $50 loan and boom, they're an entrepreneur. But the data didn't back that up, did it?
Not at all. This microfinance myth, I would say, is completely. It's been completely, uh, it's unjustified, in fact, because we don't know where that $50 is going. Right? When researchers actually track the data through randomized controlled trials, they found that these microfinance loans never really lifted those families out of poverty. So it doesn't work.
Okay, so what were people actually doing with the money?
Because of these financial obligations that a lot of these poor people have, a lot of these underprivileged people have, mostly they were paying off their older, more expensive debts or buying food, right? Because if they don't have anything to eat, then how are they supposed to work? How are they supposed to help support their family? How are they supposed to help support their households? So really what we found is very few people used it to grow a revolutionary business as these institutions had hoped for. And the issue is that microfinance requires rigid weekly repayments. If you take a loan to buy a cow in a more agricultural context, that cow does not instantly produce enough milk the next week to cover that loan installment, does it? So people can't take risks on high yield investments.
Yeah, they just buy safe, low yield inventory to keep a tiny, unscalable shop afloat. They aren't building a firm, they're just buying themselves a low paying job, I guess.
Exactly. That they can't really afford the risk of innovation because, as we know, with entrepreneurship, with becoming an entrepreneur, you have to take a much more unconventional route in society, right? You're liable for, of course, your expenses, but you also have to put aside that time. And oftentimes, to have that time, you have to have the facilities and finances to be able to back up, like an emergency fund almost. So this really just ties in directly how people make choices about fundamental things like food. And we do have to indeed talk about the food paradox.
Yeah, so let's do it. Classical economics build their models on the assumption that if you give a person in extreme poverty a little extra money, they'll buy more calories, right? Because more calories equals more energy to work harder.
Exactly. I think I talked a little more about this, but now that you've mentioned this, it's really a very mechanical way to view human behavior. But humans aren't really machines. You can't feed them oil and they'll do the work, or you can't, give them gas and they'll continue running. The data shows that they don't buy more calories, but when they get a little extra cash, they buy better tasting food like sugar or tea, these small luxuries almost. Or they skip the extra food entirely and save up for a television. And outsiders judge them heavily for this. They say, look, they don't have enough to eat, but they have a TV. They make irrational choices.
Yeah, so, but when you think about the psychology, if your life is, physically exhausting and every day is a struggle, you actually need mental relief. The need for a little daily joy, like, a sweet cup of tea or a movie on TV to escape your reality for an hour, is overwhelmingly stronger than the abstract idea of, long term health planning.
Exactly. And I honestly personally think this is very rational. And it is really rational when you view it through a lens of human survival. A TV makes life bearable today. Extra calories might make you slightly more productive next month, right? The effect won't take place instantaneously. And it's fascinating how it this manifests in the US. We don't have the TVs versus calorie trade-off or debate in the same way, but we have a massive, massive public health crisis driven by what we call food deserts, where a lot of these different neighborhoods in the US, in underserved parts of the areas and towns, are actually understaffed and they have fewer options when it comes to healthy food, which in turn results in them buying and purchasing more and more unhealthy food, which results in a public health crisis as we see today.
Could you break that down for our listeners?
Okay, perfect. So, elaborating a bit on what I said previously, a food desert is a geographic area, usually located in lower income urban neighborhoods or hollowed out rural towns. Actually, 50 miles from where I live, I live in Georgia, a pretty good part of the state in the metropolitan Atlanta region, but 50 miles away from where we live, I'm sure there's a food desert somewhere because it's a very widespread problem here in the US. So in these food deserts, it's almost physically impossible to find both affordable, fresh groceries that are healthy. So if you work two minimum wage jobs that pay you $16 per hour, which in Indian context is 1,600 rupees per hour, uh, you're really just exhausted working two double shifts. And the nearest grocery store with fresh vegetables is a 45-minute bus ride away. But there's a fast food drive-through on your corner with a dollar menu where you can buy a burger or a soda or fries. So what would you do? You would buy the fast food. It's cheap, it tastes better, and it gives you immediate comforts.
Yeah. So in India, people buy sugar for a moment of joy, and similarly in the US, people buy ultra processed fast food because the system made it the path of least resistance for the same joy, right?
Exactly. And no, as an Indian myself, I can definitely agree that, sugar sugar is my joy as well. But yes, people in the US often tend to go down the fast food route. Uh, and in both systems, wealthy politicians look down and say, why don't they just eat healthier? Which perfectly segues into the health trap. Because wealthy people love to take credit for their good health choices. But the reality that in poor economics, Banerjee and Duflo point out is that wealthy people don't make better choices. The system just makes the choices for them naturally.
Yeah, that's so true, honestly. Like, just think about our daily lives. If you or I want clean water, we walk to the kitchen and turn on the tap. Our health is subsidized by invisible infrastructure. But in severe poverty in India, Staying healthy requires active, exhausting daily effort. You have to walk miles to just get water. Then you have to spend money on firewood to boil that water every single day. So you have to actively remember to buy a mosquito net and tuck it in every single night. It requires constant cognitive effort. Like, that's so much.
Exactly. And honestly, India is a great case study, but this problem is so much more widespread than, just viewed in a South Asian context. I'm sure you're also familiar that countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America also suffer a lot from this problem. The water dilemma is a huge issue, especially in the eastern part of Africa. And then similarly, with the mosquito nets, Brazil, for example, has like insane amounts of mosquito fatalities per year because of the high variety of disease there. So there's a substantial cognitive effort, Kavya. You're absolutely right. But if we think about this in the US context, for example, I think our water is just treated at the municipal level. So there's district by district allocations and services that go ahead and filter this water. So um, because of this, it's much easier to get water, like you said. And similarly, our polio and measles vaccines are mandated by the public school system. For example, when you turn 16 here, you have to get something called a meningitis vaccine, or else they don't let you enter school on the first day. So it is severe. It's significantly much. There's significantly less cognitive effort that you have to put in. But when you force someone to make an active, preventative choice every single day, of course, procrastination kicks in. And people in developing countries will often refuse to pay 50 cents for a preventative bed net for mosquitoes or pennies for water purifying chlorine. But what if they get sick? They will suddenly start spending hundreds of dollars, take on massive amounts of debt to get an IV drip or an antibiotic shot from a private, often under-regulated doctor.
100%. Because, prevention requires you to spend money today for a benefit that you might never see. But a cure is immediate relief from visible pain. Arnav, since you work with the World Food Program, I know you love the behavioral experiments around this. Tell everyone about the lentil incentive.
Yeah, absolutely, Kavya. So this is one of my favorite experiments from the book. And guys, if you have not read Poor Economics, I really recommend you guys pick up a copy. Uh, this is one of mine and Kavya's favorite experiments from this book. So as a matter of fact, in Udaipur, India, which is a place really close to my heart as someone from Rajasthan, the government there set up a completely free immunization clinic for children, and this meant free healthcare, right? But researchers found that only 1% of parents completed the full course of vaccines. Policymakers assumed that they were anti vaccine, but simply put, it was just pure inconvenience. The parents they had to lose a day of work, lose a day's wages, and walk a long distance to one of these clinics. So the economists introduced a tiny, highly targeted change. Every time a mother brought her child for a vaccine shot, the clinic handed her a 1 kilogram bag of dried lentils.
Just the bag of lentils.
Yes, and just lentils. And then the result was quite astonishing. Immunizations rates shot up from 1% to 38%, which in an Indian context is very substantial.
That's incredible. And the reason it worked, I think, is because it changed the timeline. The benefit of the vaccine is years in the future, but the bag of lentils is obviously dinner tonight. It gave them a tangible, immediate reward that overcame the friction of walking to the clinic, I believe.
Exactly. And this goes back into that food paradox that we were talking about earlier as well. And simply put, it's engineering the environment to remove this cognitive friction. And it really highlights the mental exhaustion aspect, which is a huge part of the psychology of poverty. In the US, for example, research often referred to this as scarcity brain, where economists have found that being poor physically taxes your brain. If you're constantly worrying about surviving today, how to pay the rent, how to keep the lights on, keep your phone bill, or what to feed your kids, that anxiety eats up your cognitive bandwidth and therefore it makes you less productive.
Yeah, it literally drops your effective IQ by something like, 13 or 14 points in the moment. It makes it biologically harder to perform complex long term planning, I think.
It's a biological limit. So you're absolutely right. And I think, I'm on the same page as well. But society often asks then, why didn't they just invest? Why didn't they just open a savings account? Because their brain is in overdrive, just trying to plan how to survive a random Tuesday night or a day in advance, right? You literally do not have that power, that RAM in your brain to process a 5-year plan when your immediate present is on fire. You don't have the ability to think about 1 year in advance about where's my kid going to go to school, where am I going to sleep then, etc.
Yeah, surviving a Tuesday. I really like that phrasing. And because you're so hyper focused on Tuesday, you can't envision 5 years from now. This directly shapes the final concept I want to discuss today: aspirations, and the idea that seeing is believing. I actually looked into this recently. So, when I was drafting a research paper reviewing behavioral constraints and perceived economic mobility in southern Mexico, this was, the central theme. People only aim for what they can actually see around them. So, if a community feels that the gap between where they are and, where they want to be is completely unbridgeable, a psychological constraint kicks in. They don't just fail, they just stop trying.
Because why play a game if you know the rules are rigged against you, the odds are in against you?
Yeah, exactly. In India, this is heavily influenced by caste, rural isolation, and massive wealth gaps. If you grow up in a village where literally no one has ever gone to university or gotten a corporate job, your aspiration window shrinks to fit the people around you. You don't invest in education because you've never seen education pay off for someone like you. How does that compare to the US?
So in the US itself, I would say it's pretty similar. In fact, it's very, very similar. But I will also say in the US, there's far more immigrants that come from outside of the country. And oftentimes, I'm sure you've heard in the news as well, Kavya, that immigrants are the backbone of the US economy and the US culture as well. This country is quite literally built upon immigrants, right? So for those reasons, it does deviate a little, but that mechanism that we have in the US here is geographic and physical separation. We have a long history of redlining, which is drawing maps and essentially drawing lines between the poor and the rich, the minority neighborhoods and the majority neighborhoods, from wealthy suburbs and banking services. So if you grow up in a highly impoverished inner city area, which you can find plenty of in Atlanta, Georgia, or a hollowed out rural town, you don't really see doctors, lawyers, or economists in your daily life. You conform to the societal ideals that you've seen growing up around you. So therefore, you don't interact with the middle class and you don't really think about how do I have to get to the next level. So you have no peers to emulate, and your aspiration window really just shrinks to exactly what's on your street block. So think blue collar workers working um, shifts at the retail store, the fast food joints, or construction workers and other things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if society tells you from day one that kids from your zip code don't go to top tier universities, you kind of internalize that.
Right. You stop aspiring to it. This invisible barrier isn't just the lack of money, though it is very, very notable, but it's really the lack of hope. You don't have some sort of role model to look up to, and therefore you just settle for less, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The invisible barrier isn't just money, it's hope. That perfectly summarizes the core thesis of poor economics. It's not about people being inherently lazy or, making bad choices. I think it's about a lack of safety nets, the cognitive tax of scarcity, and inflexible systems that, punish tiny mistakes.
100%. Whether you're in Udaipur, India, or a rural county here in Georgia, or anywhere in the US, humans operate on the exact same psychology. This policy failure is that we design systems based on how we wish perfect economic robots acted, instead of designing systems for how exhausted human beings actually behave, right? And I think personally, as someone who's talking with a fellow like-minded economist like you, I think we can both agree that economics, the study of economics, is very rational, almost too rational, to the point where we can't really apply it to development contexts. So it's great to have books like Poor Economics, or other books, notable books, that talk about development finance, that really underscore this gap between rationality and real humanism.
Yeah, that's so true. 100%. So now, before I let you go, I have to pivot for a second because you have a lot of high school listeners. Arnav, you have an insane profile, right? Like a lot of international students, I'm navigating the university application process right now. So, looking at
Mhm.
the UK system, I think it feels super straightforward. They just care about your grades, your exam scores, and a highly academic personal statement. But the US system uses this buzzword, holistic admissions. So if you had to explain what holistic actually means without, using any admissions jargon, how would you define it?
Yeah, so I think the best way to go about answering this is just looking at the UK system for a bit. So I understand that you guys have, or the people in the UK have a UCAS system where you apply through a portal and you write a personal statement that is very academic. So throughout this entire UK process, like you mentioned, academics is at the forefront of everything, right? You have to have high marks, high standards, um, very strong research aptitudes, right? But then in the US, holistic admissions is really at the forefront of everything, and it's the kind of the trademark of U.S. admissions, if I like how I like to say. So holistic admission looks at like a lot of different aspects of a student's life. It looks at their financial status, their socioeconomic status, and it kind of looks at a lot of other external factors, like if the student had any family problems or any work commitments. And then it takes all of these different contexts, a lot of these different personal traits of that applicant, and then it looks at the extracurriculars, how the student engaged with their interests outside of the classroom, and it combines, of course, strong academics, strong standardized test scores like the SAT or ACT. And then it takes all of these different factors to advise the ultimate decision: reject, deferred, waitlist, or accept.
That's quite an insightful answer to it. So there's this stereotype that to get into a top US college, you need to be the varsity debate captain, play the violin, and have 500 hours of volunteering. You clearly didn't do that, right? So you went incredibly deep into development economics, if I'm right. Why is this spike strategy better than trying to do everything?
So I will definitely say that the stereotype is very, very much true. As a ninth grader 2 years ago, I would myself is very, very confused, how I should go about the application process. And I also had this idea of, getting involved in as many clubs at school, uh, economics club, debate club, this club, that club, and then the volunteering, of course. So at some point in 10th grade, I talked with a friend of mine who is currently at Wharton and is one of my best mentors. And he kind of explained this concept of the spike strategy, as you mentioned, and it's very, very effective. So the spike strategy involves just being one of the best at whatever you do and be very niche while doing so. And what the spike strategy allows for you to do is really just lock in and be the best, the period of whatever you're doing. And that's what I tried to do with development economics. And though I'm not quite there just now or just yet, that's kind of what I'm aspiring to do. And this works a lot better because when they combine you and when they compare you, and this is also one of the things with holistic admissions, they look at you and they compare you with all the other people in the same bracket as you. When they see someone who is doing 500 hours of volunteering at their local um, food pantry or local dog shelter, and they combine that with someone who is, getting good grades in school versus someone who is doing economics research like you and me, Kavya, or any of your viewers as well, and has good grades, they will surely choose the person doing the research over the person doing the volunteering, because they know that that person knows what they're doing and that that person will contribute to their department.
Yeah, I honestly really like that approach. It's like, it's just better to not be a jack of all trades and master of none, as the saying goes. So you're a high schooler working with the World Bank, the USDA, and you were a Harbinger Prize finalist. A lot of kids hear that and think he must have crazy connections. So, what's the
Hmm.
actual unglamorous reality of how a 17-year-old gets a foot in the door with massive global organizations?
So, thank you so much for that once again. I honestly think I really like to frame it as this one quote: it's bite more off than you can chew. And that's kind of the process I've followed these past 2.5 years, past 2 years since I've navigated this college admissions process. I tried to get myself in as many doors as possible, and just be someone who's likable, someone who's helpful, and someone who's easy to talk to. And then I kind of use these to climb these ladders. And like you mentioned, I don't really have crazy connections as such. Of course, my parents have been very supportive throughout the process, but it's really just opening up as many doors, reaching out to as many people, and just getting yourself out there. Like, if someone hears your name, the goal you should go for is someone hears your name, they're like, yeah, I know that man, I know that person, I want to work with him, right? And I think just working towards that mentality, that aspiration, is really what helped me get some of these research positions, win the Harbinger's Prize, and just get to where I am today.
That's quite a nice take on this. So you captained a team to the silver at the Economics World Cup. Competitions are
Huh.
great for the resume, right? But do you ever feel a tension between competing for medals and actually doing real world economic development?
So I would say that these are both entirely different. Myself, I'm a very competitive person. I used to play soccer. I wasn't really good at it, but I think I still have that sport, that spirit, that sportsmanship in me, that that willingness to compete, right? So that's kind of what has driven this competitive spirit of mine in economics. While a lot of these competitions are also very academic, just take the test, see if you do good and get in. The Economics World Cup and other competitions, they oftentimes feature both theoretical rounds and also applied case studies. So the Economics World Cup, our case study was actually surrounding Brazil, and we had to map a route for graphites, which is a mineral used in batteries and electronics, to kind of be dispersed across the world from Brazil. So we had to essentially build a plan for the Brazil Ministry of Energy and Transportation to be able to do all of this. So through that sort of case study, I was able to bridge my interest in economic development and competitive accolades, and that's really kind of where I found my middle ground there.
That's really good. So, these days people use a lot of AI, right? But when it comes to writing essays for college admissions, I think I think it's morally wrong to use AI because it's kind of a performative act that you're kind of trying to pull out. So, considering that, US college essays often seem to demand this dramatic soap opera level of storytelling. So, how do you write a compelling essay that actually gets you accepted without selling your soul or sounding fake and not trying to use AI? Like basically doing pulling this out yourself.
Absolutely. So I think, Kavya, you and I are pretty deep into this process already, right? We're about to apply this year only in 6 months or so. But for any of your younger viewers watching, I really recommend that they, of course, bite off more than they can chew. Just try to get as many different opportunities as possible, and that they also keep a record of some of these cool milestones and events that have happened to them, right? Because eventually, what will happen is at the end of the 2 3 years after they sit down to write these essays, just as we are right now, they'll see that they have an incredible list of different accomplishments and achievements that they can use to really formulate their story. And as far as these very crazy prompts and these dramatic writing styles that these US colleges really embody. I think number one, before anything else, you have to be yourself, right? It is okay to uh, exaggerate certain parts of your application, no, of your essays, in terms of um, like anecdotes and such. But I would never ever resort to using AI, because college admissions officers can see right through that, and most likely will get rejected.
Yeah, exactly. So, US admissions officers always say they want to see resilience. What is one massive failure or rejection you experienced while building this crazy economics profile? And yeah, like, could you tell us more on it?
For sure. So in terms of failures, I think there's been many. For one of my most recent initiatives, I reached out to over 500 schools, to get the message out, and I only got 8 responses, right, which is pretty underwhelming. If you put that in a context, it's basically 1.3 or 1.4% of a success rate, right? So I think this is a very recent experience, but actually not throughout the years, I'm not that old, but throughout these 2 years, it's really been a battle of strength, like battle of numbers. So just reaching out to as many people, you're gonna hear a lot of rejection, but eventually, if you reach out to as many people as possible, and you have a true drive to learn, I think it will really help you there. But that was probably the biggest challenge I faced. Just reaching out to so many people and hearing so many no's, getting left unread so many times, and just overcoming that sense of despair almost.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next question. For international students, the US system looks incredible until they see the $80,000 a year price tag. So, what's the brutal truth about need blind versus need aware admissions that international applicants need to understand before they even, apply?
So this $80,000 a year price tag is extremely crazy, and it applies to everyone, regardless of whether you're international or in state, or a U.S. citizen at private schools, right? And honestly, as someone who I'm very lucky to say that I'm pretty well off to do my family, but this is a very big financial commitment for someone like me as well, as someone who would have to take student debt. So I just wanted to mention that, because this applies equally to us here in the US as it does to international students for some of these top universities like Harvard or any of the Ivies, or top tens that are often almost private, right? But in terms of need blind and need aware admissions, I think it's really important that you look at what you have available already. I actually had 2 friends from India, both from the Delhi NCR area, who got into Harvard this year. So one of them was very well off to do, luckily, and one of them was more middle class in the Indian context. So for him, the need aware process was extremely important. So he only applied to universities that offered financial aid, so that he could cover his expenses and tuition. But for the other friend who was a little more well off to do, he didn't really have to consider that, as his financial commitments and abilities allowed for him to cover those tuition. So really do your research when you're looking at some of these universities, and make sure you're not biting off more than you can chew in that sense, because the debt can really it can be very corrosive, and it takes a lot of time to pay off.
Yeah, that's honestly the right way to put it through. So to close this out, what is one piece of conventional US admissions advice that you think is actually complete garbage?
Okay, so I think we debunked this earlier, but being I think one of the things that a lot of these counselors often emphasize is being extremely well-rounded. Being good, like being a ball, right? You don't want to be a ball in the admissions context. You want to be a spiky ball. So that's kind of one of the things that I've really never followed. Being well-rounded. So I would say everything in my application that I do, 95% of it has some sort of direct economics linkage. And that's what you should try to go for, whether you're trying to go into medical or physics, engineering, math, chemistry, or whatever else that uh, your viewers might want to do. So that is honestly the biggest piece of college advice garbage that I've heard, Kavya.
Yeah, so true. Got it. So, Arnav, thank you so much for joining me on Pine the Pound and bringing both this amazing US economic perspective and the college advice. It's actually been an incredible conversation, honestly.
The pleasure is mine, Kavya. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really once again I'm really glad we were able to get this scheduled. Keep killing it with your application. You're building something very impressive yourself. And yeah, hopefully we can see you in the US next year, in the fall for university.
Sure, likewise. Will do. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Thank you.